Welcome, time travelers. SolaTales here, and tonight's adventure takes us straight into the gentle hands of a master potter in medieval Tuscany, where clay transforms into beauty with each turn of the ancient wheel. So, dim the lights, sit back, and relax. Part 1. Dawn's First Light. The first light of dawn filtered through the wooden shutters of Lorenzo's cottage, like honey poured slowly through a sieve. Golden streams painted gentle rectangles across the rough stone floor, each beam carrying motes of dust that danced in the still morning air. The shutters, crafted from chestnut wood and weathered by countless Tuscan seasons, creaked softly as the warming air stirred them with the gentlest of movements. Lorenzo stirred beneath his linen sheets, woven from flax grown in the valley below San Gimignano's towering stone fortress. The fabric, soft from years of washing in the clear waters of the Elsa River, held the faint scent of lavender that grew wild on the hillsides surrounding his workshop. His cottage, built of the same golden limestone that formed the town's famous towers, retained the cool of night, even as the sun began its daily climb over the rolling Tuscan hills. The distant sound of bells drifted through the morning air. First, the deep, resonant toll of the collegiate church's bronze bell, cast 2 centuries earlier by master metalworkers whose techniques had been passed down through generations. The sound rolled across the terracotta rooftops like a gentle wave, followed moments later by the lighter chimes of Santa Maria Assunta and the other churches that dotted the medieval landscape. Each bell had its own voice, its own rhythm, creating a symphony that had marked the hours for the people of this valley for hundreds of years. Lorenzo's feet found the smooth stones of his floor, worn smooth by decades of daily footsteps. The stones, quarried from the nearby hills, had been laid by his grandfather when the workshop was first established. Each stone fit perfectly against its neighbors, a testament to the medieval mason's art that valued precision and permanence. The slight coolness of the stone against his bare feet was a welcome sensation, grounding him in the physical world as his mind still lingered in the peaceful space between sleep and waking. He moved slowly to the wooden basin that sat upon a simple table near the window. The basin, one of his own creations from years past, bore the subtle irregularities that marked handmade pottery, a slight asymmetry that made it more beautiful than any machine could create. The ceramic surface, glazed in a warm cream color derived from local clays mixed with ash from olive wood, held water drawn the previous evening from the well in his courtyard. The water was cool and clear, carrying the mineral taste of limestone aquifers deep beneath the Tuscan soil. As Lorenzo cupped the water in his hands and brought it to his face, he felt the gentle shock of coolness that chased away the last vestiges of sleep. Water droplets clung to his beard, each one catching and reflecting the morning light like tiny prisms. The ritual of washing was simple, unhurried. There was no need to rush when each day followed the natural rhythm of earth and sun, wheel and fire. His reflection wavered in the water's surface, distorted by gentle ripples that caught the light. The face that looked back showed the marks of 47 years spent working with clay and fire, hands permanently stained with iron oxide, laugh lines earned through years of quiet satisfaction in his craft, shoulders broad from centering countless pounds of clay on the potter's wheel. From a wooden peg driven into the stone wall, Lorenzo lifted his leather apron. The leather, tanned using oak bark in a process that took months to complete, had molded itself to his body over the years. The weight of it across his shoulders felt like an old friend's embrace, familiar and comforting. The apron bore the marks of his trade, clay stains that had become part of the leather itself, small burn marks from sparks that had flown from the kiln, smooth patches where his hands had rubbed against it thousands of times while working. The courtyard between his cottage and workshop held a small garden where Lorenzo grew the plants and gathered the materials that contributed to his craft. Chamomile bushes, their small white flowers just beginning to open to the morning sun, would later be dried and ground to create the soft yellow tints in his glazes. The iron-rich clay beneath a patch of wild rosemary would be dug and processed for the warm red-brown colors that decorated his finest pieces. A small olive tree, planted by his father decades earlier, spread its silver-green leaves in the center of the courtyard. The tree had been chosen not only for its fruit and oil, but because olive wood, when burned, created an ash rich in potash that formed the base for many of his glazes. Everything in Lorenzo's world was connected. The earth provided clay, the plants provided color, the wood provided fuel, and fire transformed it all into objects of beauty and utility. The morning air carried the scent of wild herbs that grew on the hillsides, rosemary, thyme, and sage that had been used since Roman times to flavor food, and in the hands of skilled craftsmen like Lorenzo, to create subtle variations in glaze chemistry. Each plant contributed its own mineral content when burned, adding complexity to the colors that would emerge from the kiln. As Lorenzo crossed the courtyard, the gravel beneath his wooden clogs created a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to match his heartbeat. The clogs, carved from poplar wood and shaped to fit his feet perfectly, were a gift from the village woodworker whose own craft complemented Lorenzo's. In medieval Tuscany, every artisan depended on the skills of others. The potter needed the woodworker for tools and wheel mechanisms. The woodworker needed the potter for vessels to hold his oils and stains. The workshop door, made of thick oak planks held together with iron bands forged by the local blacksmith, swung open with the slightest touch. The hinges, oiled regularly with rendered fat from the kitchen, moved silently despite their age. The door had been hung with such precision that it opened with barely a whisper, allowing Lorenzo to enter his creative sanctuary without disturbing the peaceful morning atmosphere. Part 2. The Dance of Earth and Water. The workshop welcomed Lorenzo with the embrace of familiar scents and textures. The earthy smell of clay dominated the space, a rich mineral fragrance that spoke of ancient riverbeds and mountain streams, of countless seasons of rain and drought that had shaped the very earth he worked with. This was the scent of creation itself, of potential waiting to be realized through the marriage of earth, water, and human skill. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each board worn smooth by countless clay-dusted hands. Upon these shelves sat vessels in every stage of creation, freshly thrown pieces still glistening with moisture, leather hard pots waiting for handles or decorative touches, and finished pieces ready for their journey through fire. The shelves themselves had been crafted with the same attention to detail that Lorenzo brought to his pottery. Each joint fitted precisely, each surface sanded smooth to prevent snags that might damage delicate ceramic walls. The potter's wheel stood in the center of the workshop, like an altar to the ancient craft. The main wheel, hewn from a single piece of oak and perfectly balanced, rested on a wooden shaft that extended down to a smaller wheel near the floor. This lower wheel, called a flywheel, store the momentum created by Lorenzo's foot, allowing the upper wheel to spin smoothly, even when his leg needed rest. The mechanism was a marvel of medieval engineering, passed down through generations of craftsmen who had refined its design through centuries of use. Around the wheel, arranged within easy reach, sat the tools of Lorenzo's trade. Water basins, made of his own pottery, held clear well water that would keep the clay workable throughout the day. The water caught and reflected the morning light streaming through windows set high in the stone walls, creating gentle patterns that shifted and danced as breezes stirred the surface. Clay ribs, carved from dried gourds and polished smooth through use, lay arranged by size and curve. Each rib had its own purpose, some for shaping the inside curves of bowls, others for creating the graceful necks of pitchers and vases. The largest ribs, made from sections of wheel hubs worn beyond use, could smooth the sides of great storage jars that stood taller than a man. Wire tools, made from bronze drawn thin as hair, waited ready to cut completed pieces from the wheel. The wire was attached to wooden handles worn smooth by Lorenzo's palms, each tool shaped to fit his grip perfectly. These cutting wires represented a technology that had changed little since Roman times. Sometimes the simplest solutions were also the most enduring. Lorenzo approached the wooden boxes where clay had been aging like fine wine. Medieval potters understood what modern science would later confirm, that clay improved with time as water molecules aligned themselves more perfectly with the clay particles, creating a material that was both more plastic and more responsive to the potter's touch. Some of the clay in these boxes had been aging for over a year, developing the smooth, butter-like consistency that made complex forms possible. The clay from the Elsa River Valley felt cool and smooth beneath his fingers, with a texture like silk mixed with earth. This clay, deposited over millennia by the gentle river that wound its way through the countryside, contained just the right proportion of silica and alumina to make it ideal for throwing on the wheel. When properly prepared, it would stretch and bend without cracking, allowing Lorenzo to pull thin walls and create graceful curves that seemed to defy gravity. Mountain clay, gathered from deposits high in the Tuscan hills, felt coarser between his fingers. Tiny flecks of mica caught the light like stars scattered through brown earth. This clay was stronger but less plastic, perfect for creating the sturdy bases of large vessels that would need to support considerable weight. The mica not only added strength, but created subtle sparkles in the finished pottery that caught candlelight in medieval homes. The most prized clay came from distant quarries, transported to San Gimignano by merchants who understood its value. This white clay, nearly pure kaolin, fired to an ivory color that provided the perfect canvas for colored glazes. A small amount, mixed with local clays, could lighten their color and improve their workability, making it as valuable as spices from distant lands. Lorenzo selected clay for his first piece of the day, with the care of a chef choosing ingredients for a feast. His hands, trained by decades of experience, could read the qualities of clay through touch alone. He needed a portion of river clay with just a hint of the mountain clay, creating a blend that would have the plasticity needed for throwing combined with the strength required for the piece he had in mind. The process of wedging the clay, kneading it to remove air bubbles and create uniform consistency, was itself a meditation. Lorenzo's hands pressed and folded the clay in a rhythm that matched his breathing, each movement deliberate and necessary. Air bubbles, trapped in clay, could cause pieces to explode in the kiln, so this process was both practical and spiritual, a way of bringing order and harmony to the raw material. As he wedged, Lorenzo felt the clay responding to his touch, becoming more unified with each fold and press. The slightly cool material gradually warmed under his hands, reaching the perfect temperature for throwing, warm enough to be responsive, cool enough to maintain its shape. This transformation from cold, stiff earth to warm, living clay was one of the small miracles that made Lorenzo grateful for his craft. The wooden stool beside his wheel bore the smooth indentations where Lorenzo had sat for thousands of hours over the decades. The seat, carved from a single piece of chestnut and worn smooth by use, fit his body perfectly. As he settled onto the familiar seat, his feet found their natural positions. Right foot on the large flywheel, left foot braced against the wheel's sturdy frame. Water from the ceramic basin beside him caught the morning light, creating gentle reflections that played across the workshop walls. The basin itself was one of Lorenzo's pieces from years past, glazed in a soft green that reminded him of new olive leaves in spring. The rim had been shaped to pour cleanly, and the interior curve guided water exactly where his fingers needed it most. With his foot, Lorenzo began to turn the great wheel. The motion was smooth and steady, a rhythm learned so thoroughly that it required no conscious thought. His leg muscles, strengthened by years of this daily dance, powered the wheel with an efficiency that would have impressed any miller or blacksmith. The wheel gathered momentum slowly, each revolution adding to its stored energy until it spun with a life of its own. The clay, centered carefully on the wheel's wooden surface, began to move with hypnotic regularity. Lorenzo's hands approached the spinning clay with the reverence of a priest approaching an altar. The first touch was always magical, the moment when clay and craftsman became partners in creation, when earth and human intention merged into something greater than either could achieve alone. Water flowed over his hands and onto the clay, creating the slick surface that would allow his palms to guide and shape without resistance. The sensation was like touching liquid stone, material that was neither solid nor liquid, but something uniquely itself. Medieval potters had no scientific understanding of clay's molecular structure, but they knew its properties as intimately as farmers knew their soil or vintners knew their grapes. As the wheel spun and his hands embraced the clay, Lorenzo felt the familiar peace that came with this ancient dance. His breathing naturally synchronized with the wheel's rhythm, creating a meditative state that connected him to every potter who had ever sat at a wheel, stretching back through centuries to the first craftsman who discovered that spinning clay could be shaped into vessels of impossible thinness and perfect symmetry. The clay began to respond to the gentle pressure of his palms, rising and spreading as his hands guided its movement. This was the magic that never grew old, watching formless earth transform into functional beauty through the simple application of skill, patience, and understanding. Each revolution of the wheel brought new possibilities, new opportunities to coax grace and utility from humble mud. Part 3. The Rhythm of Seasons. As the clay rose between Lorenzo's hands, taking on the first suggestion of its destined form, the morning light shifted and strengthened, painting new patterns across the workshop walls. The shadows of pottery arranged on the shelves created an ever-changing gallery of silhouettes, each one telling the story of earth transformed by fire and human intention. The piece growing on the wheel began as a simple cylinder, its walls drawing upward with each gentle pull of Lorenzo's fingers. The clay, now warm from the heat of his hands and the friction of shaping, responded like a living thing to his touch. Medieval potters spoke of clay having moods and preferences, requiring different approaches on different days, depending on the weather, the season, and mysterious qualities that could only be sensed through decades of experience. This morning's clay felt particularly cooperative, stretching evenly as Lorenzo gradually increased the internal space that would become the vessel's hollow heart. His left hand, working inside the form, pressed gently outward, while his right hand supported the outer wall, creating the perfect balance of forces that allowed the clay to rise without collapse. The sensation was like holding water in cupped palms, requiring just enough pressure to maintain control without destroying the delicate structure. The rhythm of the wheel had become as natural as breathing. Lorenzo's foot maintained the steady pace that would allow him to work for hours without fatigue, a tempo learned through years of practice that synchronized perfectly with his heartbeat and the natural rhythm of his hands. The great oak wheel, worn smooth by countless hours of use, spun with the accumulated momentum of generations. His grandfather's foot had powered this same wheel, and his grandfather's grandfather before him. Water splashed gently as Lorenzo's hands moved up the cylinder's walls, each pass making them slightly thinner and taller. The excess water, carrying tiny particles of clay, flowed down the spinning vessel and collected in a shallow groove carved around the wheel's edge. This groove, cut into the wood decades earlier, served the practical purpose of keeping water from splashing beyond the work area while creating a gentle, continuous sound that added to the workshop's peaceful atmosphere. The transformation happening beneath his hands was one that had captivated humans since the dawn of civilization. Clay formed over millions of years as mountains weathered into valleys, had waited in the earth for this moment of partnership with human creativity. The particles that now responded to Lorenzo's touch had once been part of granite peaks, worn away grain by grain, and carried by ancient rivers to the deposits where medieval potters would discover them. As the morning progressed, the simple cylinder began to take on the characteristics of its intended purpose. A water jug for the monastery of Sant'Agostino, whose brothers had commissioned it for their refectory. The belly of the vessel swelled under Lorenzo's careful guidance, creating the generous capacity needed to serve the community's daily needs. The curve was not arbitrary, but followed principles of function and beauty that medieval craftsmen understood intuitively. The neck of the jug emerged from the rounded body like a flower stem rising from rich soil. Lorenzo's fingers, working with practiced precision, drew the clay upward in a smooth, unbroken curve. The opening needed to be wide enough for easy filling, yet narrow enough to control pouring, a balance that required both technical skill and aesthetic judgment. The clay, now stretched to its limits, maintained its integrity through the perfect combination of material properties and craftsman's knowledge. Throughout the forming process, Lorenzo's movements remained fluid and unhurried. Medieval time was different from modern time, measured not by mechanical precision, but by the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset, of seasonal changes, and the human need for rest and nourishment. The pottery wheel demanded its own tempo, one that could not be rushed without risking collapse of the delicate forms taking shape. The historical traditions that guided Lorenzo's work stretched back through centuries of accumulated knowledge. Tuscan potters had learned their techniques from Roman craftsmen, who had inherited methods from the Greeks, who had built upon the discoveries of even more ancient civilizations. Each generation added refinements and innovations, creating a continuous chain of knowledge that connected every medieval potter to the very origins of ceramic art. Islamic influence had reached Tuscany through trade routes that brought not only exotic spices and precious metals, but also revolutionary pottery techniques. The use of tin-based glazes, which created brilliant white surfaces perfect for decorative painting, had transformed European pottery during the medieval period. These glazes, combined with traditional European methods, created new possibilities for both beauty and function. The guild system that governed medieval crafts ensured that knowledge was preserved and standards maintained. The Arte de Vasai, the Potter's Guild, required 7 years of apprenticeship before a craftsman could establish his own workshop. This system, while restrictive, guaranteed that complex skills were passed down intact from master to student, preserving techniques that might otherwise be lost to time. As Lorenzo shaped the jug's spout, his tools became extensions of his hands. A thin wooden rib, carved from boxwood and polished to silk smoothness, helped define the elegant curve where spout met neck. The tool, made by his own hands years earlier, had been shaped and reshaped through use until it performed its function with perfect efficiency. Medieval craftsmen understood that the relationship between artisan and tool was as important as the relationship between craftsman and material. The morning's work progressed with the steady pace of seasons changing or trees growing, gradual, natural, inevitable. Each movement of Lorenzo's hands was informed by thousands of hours of practice. Yet each piece remained a unique creation, influenced by subtle variations in clay, weather, and the potter's own state of mind. No two pieces were ever identical, even when shaped by the same hands, using the same techniques. The water jug neared completion as the sun climbed higher, its rays now streaming through the workshop's eastern windows with increased intensity. The shadows of completed pottery shifted and shortened, creating new patterns of light and dark across the stone floor. In a few hours, the fierce heat of midday would make working at the wheel uncomfortable. But for now, the temperature remained perfect for the delicate work of pottery creation. Part 4. Fire and Transformation. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the workshop floor, Lorenzo's attention turned to the great beehive kiln that stood at the far end of his workspace like a sleeping giant. Built from local stone and shaped clay, the kiln represented the culmination of medieval pottery technology, a structure that could reach temperatures hot enough to transform clay into ceramic while maintaining the precise control necessary to prevent cracking or warping. The kiln's construction had taken Lorenzo and his father an entire season to complete. Each stone had been selected for its ability to withstand repeated heating and cooling without cracking. The inner chamber was lined with special refractory clay, mixed with crushed pottery shards called grog, that added strength and thermal stability. The dome shape was not accidental, but represented centuries of refinement, creating the most efficient distribution of heat while requiring the minimum amount of fuel. Loading the kiln was an art as complex as throwing pottery itself. Each piece needed to be positioned to receive even heating while being protected from direct flame contact, that could cause cracking or unwanted color variations. Lorenzo had learned this skill through years of observation and occasional heartbreaking failures when entire kiln loads might be lost to poor stacking or inadequate temperature control. The pottery pieces destined for today's firing had been carefully arranged on wooden boards, allowing air to circulate around each piece during the final drying period. The water jug created that morning would need several more days to reach the leather-hard stage, perfect for firing, but older pieces waited ready for their transformation. Storage jars for oil and wine, domestic bowls for the town's households, and decorative pieces commissioned for the local church all waited their turn in the fire. Lorenzo began by carefully placing the largest pieces in the kiln center, where temperatures would be most even and predictable. Great amphora-style storage jars, their walls thick enough to withstand the thermal stress of firing, formed the backbone of the load. These vessels, designed to hold the olive oil and wine that formed the foundation of the medieval Tuscan economy, required perfect firing to ensure they would not leak or crack under the weight of their contents. Smaller pieces filled the spaces between larger vessels, each one positioned with care to avoid contact that might cause sticking or breakage during firing. Bowls nested inside one another with layers of fine sand between them to prevent fusion during the extreme heat. The sand, gathered from a specific riverbank known for its purity, would protect the pottery surfaces while adding subtle texture variations prized by medieval collectors. The arrangement of pottery in the kiln followed principles learned through generations of trial and error. Pieces with similar clay bodies and firing requirements were grouped together, while vessels intended for different glazing treatments were separated to prevent unwanted chemical interactions. The process required not only technical knowledge, but also an intuitive understanding of how fire would move through the kiln chamber during the long firing cycle. As evening approached, Lorenzo began the ritual of lighting the kiln. The fuel had been carefully selected and prepared weeks in advance. Seasoned oak split into precise sizes for steady burning, pine kindling for quick ignition, and precious olive wood saved for the crucial final hours when maximum temperature was needed. Each wood type burned with different characteristics, and successful firing depended on understanding how to sequence their use throughout the long night ahead. The first flames, fed by dry pine shavings and thin kindling, licked eagerly at the base of the fuel chamber. Lorenzo watched the fire's behavior with the attention of a physician monitoring a patient's pulse, reading in the color and movement of the flames the story of combustion efficiency and airflow. Medieval potters had developed an almost supernatural ability to read fire, understanding how slight adjustments in damper position or fuel arrangement could mean the difference between success and disaster. As darkness fell over San Gimignano, the kiln began to radiate heat that could be felt throughout the workshop. The massive stone structure absorbed thermal energy slowly, storing it in its walls like a great battery that would release heat evenly throughout the firing cycle. This thermal mass was crucial to the process. It prevented rapid temperature changes that could shock the pottery into cracking while maintaining the steady heat needed for complete vitrification. The firing would continue through the night, requiring Lorenzo's constant attention. Medieval potters understood that ceramic transformation was not simply a matter of reaching high temperature, but of controlling the rate of heating, the atmosphere inside the kiln, and the careful cooling that would determine the final strength and color of the finished pottery. Too much oxygen during firing created one set of colors, while reducing the oxygen produced entirely different effects. Lorenzo settled into the comfortable chair positioned beside the kiln for the long night's work. The chair, worn smooth by his father and grandfather before him, faced the kiln's observation boards, where he could monitor the fire's progress throughout the night. A small table held oil lamps that would provide light for reading the fire's color, along with clay tablets, where he recorded observations about each firing for future reference. The rhythm of feeding the fire became as natural as breathing. Every 20 minutes, Lorenzo added carefully measured amounts of fuel, maintaining the steady temperature rise that would transform clay into ceramic over the course of 12 hours. The wood split with satisfying cracks as it met the intense heat, releasing aromatic smoke that carried the essence of Tuscan forests into the night air. Through the kiln's peepholes, Lorenzo could observe the pottery's gradual transformation. In the early hours, the pieces remained visibly clay-like, but began to lose their raw appearance as residual moisture evaporated in white wisps that danced in the flame light. As temperatures rose, the clay began to glow with its own heat. First a dull red, then orange, finally reaching the bright yellow-white that indicated complete ceramic transformation. The night sounds of medieval Tuscany provided a gentle backdrop to the firing process. Owls called from the olive groves that surrounded San Gimignano, their voices carrying across valleys where generations of farmers had tended vines and grain. The distant lowing of cattle, secure in stone-walled courtyards, mixed with the rustle of wind through cypress trees that stood like dark sentinels against the star-filled sky. Part 5. Dawn's Return. As the first light of a new day began to filter through the workshop windows, Lorenzo gradually reduced the fire's intensity, beginning the careful cooling process that would determine the final quality of his pottery. The kiln, now radiating heat like a small sun, would take 2 full days to cool completely, a period of patient waiting that medieval potters understood as essential to their craft. The gradual cooling was as critical as the heating process itself. Clay that had been transformed into ceramic at temperatures approaching that of molten metal needed time to adjust slowly to normal temperatures. Too rapid cooling would create thermal shock, causing finished pieces to crack or shatter just when they had successfully completed their journey through fire. Lorenzo banked the fire's remaining coals carefully, adding just enough fuel to maintain gentle heat while allowing the overall temperature to drop slowly. The science behind this process would not be understood for centuries, but medieval craftsmen had learned through experience that patience during cooling prevented the internal stresses that could destroy perfectly fired pottery. As morning light strengthened, Lorenzo could peer through the kiln's observation ports to see the pottery glowing softly in the diminishing heat. The pieces that had been raw clay 24 hours earlier now possessed the distinctive ring of fired ceramic when tapped with a wooden tool. The transformation was complete, yet the results would remain hidden until the kiln was cool enough to open safely. The waiting period that followed each firing was a time of quiet anticipation mixed with philosophical acceptance. Lorenzo had learned long ago that pottery, like life itself, involved elements beyond human control. The finest clay, most skillful throwing, and most careful firing could still result in unexpected outcomes when fire and earth interacted in ways too complex for complete prediction. During these cooling days, Lorenzo turned his attention to other aspects of his craft. Glazes needed preparation, requiring the careful grinding of minerals and the precise blending of ingredients, whose proportions had been refined through generations of experimentation. The mortar and pestle used for this work, carved from hard granite, produced a rhythmic sound that carried across the workshop as rock ground against rock, reducing crystalline materials to powder fine as flour. Lead oxide, the foundation of most medieval glazes, came from nearby mines where Roman engineers had first extracted the metal 2 millennia earlier. Mixed with silica from crushed quartz and colored with various metal oxides, lead glaze created the brilliant glass-like surfaces that made pottery both beautiful and functional. The glazes were applied to pottery that had been fired once, then refired at lower temperatures to melt the glaze into a permanent surface. Copper oxide produced the rich green glazes prized for decorative pieces, while iron oxide created warm browns and reds that complemented the natural tones of Tuscan architecture. Tin oxide, rare and expensive, but capable of producing brilliant white surfaces, was reserved for the finest pieces or special commissions from wealthy patrons. Each oxide required different firing conditions and techniques, knowledge that was passed down through carefully guarded apprenticeships. The preparation of glazes required the same meditative attention as throwing pottery. The grinding process could take hours for a single batch, but Lorenzo found peace in the repetitive motion and the gradual transformation of coarse minerals into fine powder. The sound of grinding became a kind of music, varying in pitch and rhythm as the materials broke down and became ready for mixing with water into the creamy suspension that would coat the pottery. When the kiln finally cooled enough for opening, Lorenzo approached with the excitement of a child and the caution of experience. The first pottery revealed by removing the kiln's temporary door always provided the answer to questions that had occupied his mind throughout the firing process. Some pieces would exceed his expectations, displaying colors and textures that the fire had created through its own mysterious alchemy. Others might show flaws that would teach him something new about clay, glaze, or fire behavior. The unloading process required the same careful attention as loading had demanded. Pottery fresh from the kiln, though no longer glowing with heat, remained fragile until it had time to adjust completely to normal temperatures. Lorenzo lifted each piece with reverence, examining it for the subtle signs that indicated successful firing. The clear ring when tapped, the smooth surface free of cracks, the even color that showed uniform heating. A water jug emerged from the kiln with a glaze that had developed an unexpected but beautiful pattern, where wood ash had settled on its surface during firing. The ash, rich in potash from olive wood, had created subtle color variations that turned the simple vessel into a work of art. These happy accidents were treasures that reminded Lorenzo why he continued to find wonder in his ancient craft, even after decades of practice. The monastery's storage jars had fired perfectly, their thick walls showing no signs of stress from the intense heat they had endured. The lead glaze on their interiors had melted into a smooth, impervious surface that would protect the precious olive oil they were destined to contain. Each jar represented not just Lorenzo's skill, but the accumulated knowledge of countless potters who had refined these techniques through centuries of experimentation. A set of household bowls displayed the warm brown color that came from iron-rich local clay, fired in the reducing atmosphere Lorenzo had created by restricting airflow during the final hours of firing. These bowls, destined for a merchant's family, would serve daily needs for generations, holding grain, mixing bread dough, serving meals that brought families together around wooden tables throughout the medieval world. The successful firing represented more than just transformed clay. It was the completion of a cycle that connected earth to human need, individual creativity to community welfare, ancient tradition to daily innovation. Lorenzo felt the quiet satisfaction that came from work well done, from serving his community's needs while expressing his own creative vision through the medium of earth and fire. As he carefully arranged the finished pottery on cooling shelves, Lorenzo was already planning the next firing. Clay was aging in its wooden boxes. New commissions waited for his attention, and the wheel stood ready for another day's work. The rhythm of creation was endless, like the seasons themselves, each firing leading naturally to the next, each finished piece making space for new possibilities. The medieval world depended on craftsmen like Lorenzo in ways that modern people could barely imagine. Every vessel in every household had been shaped by human hands. Every storage jar represented someone's livelihood. Every decorative piece carried the potter's understanding of beauty and proportion. There were no factories, no mass production, only the ancient partnership between skilled hands and responsive clay. Market day approached, and Lorenzo began the careful process of preparing his pottery for transport to San Gimignano's weekly market. Each piece was wrapped in straw and soft cloth, then nestled in wooden crates designed to protect delicate ceramics during the journey over rough medieval roads. The straw, gathered from local wheat fields after harvest, not only provided cushioning, but also smelled of summer sunshine and ripened grain. His donkey, Lucia, waited patiently in the courtyard, her dark eyes reflecting the wisdom of an animal that had made the journey to market countless times. The wooden cart, its wheels iron-bound by the village blacksmith, could carry several 100 pounds of pottery when properly loaded. The relationship between potter and beast was one of mutual respect. Lucia understood the precious nature of her cargo, while Lorenzo appreciated her steady pace and sure footing on uncertain paths. The journey to market was itself a meditation, offering Lorenzo time to observe the changing countryside and reflect on his place in the larger community. The pottery in his cart represented hours of patient work, but also his connection to every household that would use his vessels, every table that would be graced by his bowls, every church that would display his decorative pieces in celebration of divine beauty. As the cart rolled along paths worn smooth by centuries of use, Lorenzo felt the deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work. His pottery would outlast him, serving families for generations while carrying forward the traditions he had inherited and refined. In workshops throughout Tuscany, other potters were performing the same ancient dance of clay and fire, each adding their own interpretation to techniques as old as civilization itself. The sun climbed higher, warming Lorenzo's shoulders as Lucia's steady pace carried them towards the market square, where merchants and artisans would display the fruits of their labor. The pottery shifted slightly in its straw padding with each bump and curve in the road, but the careful packing held everything secure. This journey, repeated weekly throughout his career, connected Lorenzo's workshop to the larger world of medieval commerce and community. In the distance, The towers of San Gimignano rose against the blue Tuscan sky like stone prayers reaching toward heaven. These towers, built by wealthy families to display their power and prosperity, also served as landmarks for travelers and traders who brought exotic materials and new ideas to enrich the local crafts. The town's position on the Via Francigena, the great pilgrimage route to Rome, ensured a constant flow of visitors who might purchase pottery to carry home as tokens of their journey. The market square, paved with stones quarried from nearby hills, would soon fill with the voices of merchants calling their wares and customers examining goods with the careful attention that marked medieval commerce. Lorenzo's pottery would find its place among displays of woven cloth, leather goods, metalwork, and the agricultural products that sustained life in this prosperous valley. As the story of this firing day drew to its close, Lorenzo felt the peaceful satisfaction that came from work aligned with natural rhythms and community needs. Tomorrow would bring new clay to center on the wheel, new forms to coax from earth and water, new opportunities to participate in the ancient alchemy that transformed humble mud into vessels of lasting beauty and utility. The wheel waited in his workshop, ready to spin again, ready to partner with skilled hands in the endless dance of creation. Clay waited in its wooden boxes, patiently aging like wine until it reached the perfect consistency for throwing. Fire waited in carefully stacked wood, ready to provide the transformative heat that would complete the potter's work. In this rhythm of creation, destruction, and renewal, Lorenzo found not just his livelihood, but his connection to the eternal cycles that governed all life. The potter's wheel, ancient symbol of time and fate, continued its patient rotation, ready to shape not just clay, but the continuing story of human creativity and community connection that stretched from the medieval world into an unknowable but hopeful future. And as the gentle afternoon light filtered through the workshop windows, illuminating motes of clay dust that danced in the air like tiny spirits, Lorenzo prepared to begin again, to take another lump of earth and guide it through the timeless transformation that connected his hands to every potter who had ever lived, and to every potter yet to come. The wheel turned slowly under his foot, patient and eternal, ready to spin another day, another year, another generation of stories shaped in clay and fired in flame. In the quiet workshop, surrounded by the fruits of his labor and the tools of his trade, Lorenzo found the deep peace that comes from work that serves both practical need and eternal beauty, from a life lived in harmony with the ancient rhythms of earth, water, air, and fire. The clay waited as it had waited for millennia, ready to become whatever loving hands might shape it into. And in the gentle turning of the wheel, in the careful pressure of fingers guiding clay toward its destined form, the eternal story of human creativity continued, one revolution at a time, one breath at a time, one quiet moment of perfect concentration at a time. The wheel turned on, as it always had, as it always would, carrying forward the ancient song of creation that began when the first potter discovered that earth and water, touched by fire and guided by human hands, could become something beautiful, something useful, something that would endure long after the hands that shaped it had returned to the very earth from which they had drawn their inspiration. And so our time traveler's journey comes to rest here, in this peaceful workshop where time moves to the rhythm of the potter's wheel, where creation happens slowly and deliberately, where the ancient dance between human hands and humble clay continues as it has for thousands of years, and as it will continue for thousands more. Sleep well, fellow travelers, and dream of gentle hands shaping beautiful things from simple earth, of work that serves both beauty and purpose, of quiet lives lived in harmony with the eternal rhythms that connect us all to the turning of the world itself. The wheel turns slowly to a stop. The workshop falls silent, and peaceful sleep embraces the potter and all who have shared his timeless story.